Now we move on to creating the third application in our course. And what we're going to be creating is a simple tapping game. Now, just like how we created our reaction game, we're going to be using NS timers and ints to control how the game is basically run and set up. So what's basically going to happen, we're going to press a button and it's going to start a countdown from 10 to 0. And within those 10 seconds, we've got to tap our button as many times as we possibly can to get our score. So basically, it's how many times we can tap within 10 seconds. So what we need to do to create this game is a few things. We're going to need our start button. Now this button here will begin our game and start our 10-second countdown. So I'm simply rename this start. Then we're going to have a couple of labels. So I'm going to throw these labels in. Our labels are simply going to have the time that's counting down from 10. So I'll just center this and quickly rename this one 10. So this will start from 10. And then we're going to have a second label underneath, which will be how many taps we have given within 10 seconds. So we just equal that one to 0. And then we're going to have our final second button, which will be the button that we use to tap to increase our score. So I'll simply name this one Tap Me when it goes and starts to react. So how it's going to happen again is we're going to press start. It's then going to start this countdown of our first label from 10 all the way to 0. And within that time that it's counting down from 10 to 0, we'll have this button here enabled to, once we press it, will increase the score on our second label. And then once our timer hits 0, we can no longer press our tap me button, and then we're now given a score to see. And you can compete with your friends to see how many taps and who can tap the most within 10 seconds. So we've got this set up. I'm going to bring up our assistant editor now, as we need to create our actions and outlets for it. So make sure you select on the viewcontroller.h, and first I'm going to add in our NS timer and our 2 ints. So we create our parentheses brackets there. Now, just like before, how we've learned how to do these timers in previous lectures, we simply start by typing out NS timer, and I'll simply name this asterisk timer. There we go. And then we need to create 2 ints. One for the time counting down. So we create an int and call it our time int. And a second one for counting how many times we have tapped our button. So we name this one the tap int, and then that with a semicolon. Okay, so we've done that. We can now create our actions and outlets for our labels and buttons. So we start with our labels. We start with our time one here. We'll just simply call this our time label. Rename that, sorry, time label. There we go. This one will be our tap label. There we go. And then we need to create an action for our start button. So this will be our start game button. And make sure that is an action on the connection there. And then do the same for our tap button and making sure this is our tap button. There we go. And again, making sure that's an action and connect that up. Now, there's one more thing we need to do to our tap button is we need to create an outlet for it. Now, the reason we're going to be creating an outlet for this is because when the game hasn't started, we need to disable the button so we can't tap it. And when the countdown has begun, we can re-enable the button to tap. And once our timer hits 0, it will disable the button once more. So to do that, we need an outlet. So I'll just simply name this one tap button outlet. And add that in. Okay, so we've got all the actions and outlets, our timers and ints that we need. We're going to close the assistant editor, go back to the standard editor, and jump straight into our viewcontroller.m. Okay, so we space out our start button here. Now, before we go into our start button, in our view did load, we need to set up our 2 ints and our tap button. So our time int is going to equal 10, to end that with a semicolon. So when the view loads up, these is when it's going to trigger. Our tap int is going to equal 0. And our tap button outlet, we need to do self dot tap button outlet dot enabled is going to equal no. Make sure there's a space there, and then a semicolon. So when that the view loads up, or the application loads up, our time int is going to be set to 10, our tap int is going to be set to 0, and our tap outlet, button outlet, or our tap button is going to be disabled. So we can't use it or press it until we start the game. So within our start game IB action button here, we're going to create an if statement. So if our time int is equal to 10, then we can then begin to start the game. So what's going to happen is our tap int, I'll space it down the new line, our tap int is going to equal 0. Even though we've already equaled it to 0 in the view did load, this is for when we've completed the game we want to play again. We're just going to cover our backs there to equal it to 0 as soon as we press it. We're then going to move on to then getting our self dot tap button outlet dot enabled to simply equal then yes. So we have re-enabled our button when we go to start the game. We are then also going to trigger our timer. So we create our timer space equal space bracket ns timer to equal our scheduled timer with time interval. We need the bottom one with the target and the selector and the user info. And in the interval here, we're simply going to put 1.0. As we're counting down, so we need to do it every second. So this will repeat itself every second. In the target, we're going to simply do self. In the selector, we do @selector, and we keep that highlighted for just a moment. As we jump straight to our user info, we place in nil and repeat. We obviously want yes, as we want it to continue repeating until we've counted down. Okay, so we've got that. We're now just going to create a quick void statement underneath our button here. So dash bracket void, and this was simply named our start counter, and create our parentheses and enter it there. And then quickly copy and paste the name and place it within our selector. So it knows which void statement it needs to keep repeating over and over again for every second. So within our start counter here, we need to get this to simply count down 1 every time it repeats. So our time int is then going to minus equals 1 every time this void statement gets called, which will get repeated every second. And then we want to display this, so we do self dot time label dot text is going to equal our bracket ns string with format, and in the format here we do @ 2 quotation marks, and then we do semicolon space time int. And to get our time int to be displayed within our quotation marks here, we do simply the percentage sign and the letter I, which will display in our int and display the text and the time counting down from 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, all the way down to 0 within our time label. Okay, so we've set that set up then. So it's going to keep counting down, and we want it to stop when it reaches 0. So if I just space this out, so you can see here. So once our timer hits 0, we want the timer to stop counting down, as if we don't do that, it will continue going from 0 to -1, -2, and it'll continue and it won't stop. So what we need to do then is create another if statement within our void statement. So if our time int is equal to 0, then we do bracket timer invalidate, and out the bracket and a semicolon. So this will completely stop the timer, this piece of code here, repeating itself every second, and it will stop it at 0. So we're going to go to build and run and test it out to see how it looks. So as it starts up now, our time int and our tap int is set to 10 and 0, which doesn't really display on the screen. This is already done and configured in our interface builder, but our tap button outlet has been disabled, which it's now grayed out and we can't do anything with it. It's not until we press start that it becomes re-enabled and active to press, which doesn't do anything at the moment as we haven't set it to do anything, but you can now see our timer counting down, and as it hits 0, it will invalidate the timer and completely stop. So now we need to move on to having the ability to, when we press our tap button, to +1 into our counter. So we're going to scroll down here. I'm just going to space this out so we can see it a little bit better, and space out our tap button action. And what we're going to do is start with creating the counting kind of feature every time we press it. So what we need to do is create an if statement. So if our time int is greater than the number 0. So if it's higher than 0, enables us to press it to +1 to our counting or our tap int. So we do our tap int is then going to plus equals 1 every time it's been touched, and we're going to display that within our tap label. So you do self.tap label .text space equals space bracket ns string with format, and just like how we displayed our timer in our time label, do our symbol 2 quotation marks comma, and we do our tap int and a bracket and a semicolon, and just like up here we need our percentage sign and the letter I to display that int within our string. So we do a percentage and the letter I. So again, if you go to build and run, once you press start, as it starts to count down, as our timer is greater than the number 0, we can continue to tap. But as soon as our timer hits 0, we should no longer be able to tap. And as you can see here, I'm tapping and nothing's happening. Now this is because our timer is no longer greater than the number 0. So we can no longer perform this if statement. So now that we've done that, we need to then create an if statement to what happens if our timer reaches 0. So we need to be able the ability to disable our button and then have the ability to restart the game. So within our tap button here, underneath that if statement, we're going to create a second one. So this time, if our time int is then equal to 0, what's going to happen then is we're going to set our time int back to 10, and then we're going to get our tap int, and then we're going to set that to 0. So we're resetting the two ints, and we're going to make sure that both of these are displayed. So if we copy both of these pieces of code here to display them in the labels, so our time label is displaying our time int, and our tap label is then displaying our tap int, our new updated kind of int statuses. And then we're going to get our self.tap button outlet enabled to simply equal no. So then we're disabling the button once we've pressed it. So if we go to build and run, we can start the game. It enables our button. We can tap it as many times as we possibly can within the 10 seconds that it's counting down to. But you'll notice as soon as it hits 0, again we couldn't really continue to tap anymore. But then when we press it, it restarts the game, disabling its own button, and then we can press start to start the countdown once more to see how many times we can tap within the 10 seconds it's counting down to. So we continue. As soon as it hits 0 there, this time we got to 45, and then as soon as I press tap me once more, it resets it, and we can start the game again and continue to count down. And see if we can get any more than I did previously. So my record was 45, but no, that's 43 there. I ain't going to get any further. So there we have it then. The basis of a simple tap-based game. You can take this one step further and maybe increasing the time limits, maybe the score that gets tapped when you press it. You can even introduce leaderboards and then add your own images to the buttons and graphics, which we'll learn further on in the course. But it's a great way to challenge your friends and even add the ability to have social options where you can publish your score to your Facebook or Twitter, or even send it as a text message to your friends just to gloat and say, basically, I beat your score, let's see if you can do any better. But this is a brilliant basis to a tap-based game. And as you progress further on the course and learn more abilities and how to add stuff to more applications, you can come back to this and add in more features. So that's it for our third application in the course, as we now move on to learning more functions before we create our fourth application later on in the course.